it's a real pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. It's, as most of you know, this is a discussion, a screening, and a mini exhibition, which you can see in the back, on the occasion of issue 58 of e-flux journal, which is dedicated to Elizabeth Pavanelli and her concept of quasi-events. And Beth doesn't want, no applause. I mean, this concept of quasi-events has hit all of us in different ways, and I think it falls and it spins in many different ways, but maybe it could be summarized really shortly by understanding it as a kind of politics of exhaustion and exertion, which basically, if we have been trained and conditioned after some centuries of a period we might place in the liberal tradition to understand notions of freedom and of emancipation in terms of escape, or in terms of freedom and emancipation itself. With the proposal that Beth makes is that actually if we understand ourselves as being constituted and created by conditions where we are exhausted, where we are depleted, where we can't push any further, and yet we have to keep pushing and moving on, that these actually constitute our lives, our conditions, our politics more than any kind of daydream fantasies of liberation or emancipation or moving beyond, right? But then if we extend this to notions of infrastructure, to build space, and to the wires and the piping and the construction of our lives, if we understand that the limitations of these can't just be dreamed into new, sparkling, better conditions, and that these dreams don't actually produce other concrete circumstances, and then another way of looking at it might be to see ourselves as being sculpted actually by these limits, by their insufficiencies, and by their inabilities, by the poverty that we are already living in. So then, perhaps, if you look to recent social movements that might have gone a bit sour, that might not have ended up the way that their organizers intended, that might have been taken up by people who were not involved in organizing them, that went a different way, then it would be maybe a matter of reading what actually happens in reverse through the wall that it hits, right? Okay, so I can keep rambling on this, but maybe I should actually introduce our speakers. So first, and I encourage everyone also to read the kind of beautifully written description which Beth and I worked together on, but slowly kind of as it went more into Beth's domain, became actually more and more stunning, and I think this says it a lot better than than I can. So we have two main sections tonight. The first is a discussion between Elizabeth Pavanelli, Julieta Aranda, Natasha Genwala, Dilip Gaonkar, and the second part will be a screening of When the Dogs Talked, followed by a discussion with Liza Johnson, Beth Pavanelli, and David Barker. So just to introduce our speakers for tonight, Julieta Aranda is an artist and one of the editors of e-flux journal. Her current works allude to the present historical moment, where it starts to be possible to dismantle the cultural imperative, to transform the media so that they can function as tools for collective use, rather than as instruments for cultural domination. David Barker is a filmmaker, editor, and screenwriter. His micro-budget feature, Daylight, opened to rave reviews and was the critic's pick in both the New York Times and the New York Post on its release. His prior feature, Afraid of Everything, premiered at the 1999 Sundance Film Festival and was called A Miracle of Indie Filmmaking by the New York Post. A Short 7 Days premiered at the Rotterdam Film Festival and screened at over 40 international venues. Dilip Kankar is an associate professor of rhetoric and public culture and the director of the Center of Global Culture and Communication at Northwestern University. He is also the director of the Center for Transcultural Studies, an independent scholarly research network concerned with global issues. Natasha Gunwala is an independent curator, researcher, and writer. She was a member of the artistic team at the 8th Berlin Biennial for Contemporary Art in 2014, and her recent work includes the multi-part curatorial project Landings, together with Vivian Zehro. Liza Johnson is the writer and director of the feature film Return from 2011, and the director of Hate Ship, Love Ship from 2013. She has also made many short films and installation projects that have been exhibited in festivals, galleries, and museums internationally. Beth Pavanelli teaches anthropology and gender studies at Columbia University. She was previously editor of Public Culture, and her most recent books are The Empire of Love from 2006 and Economies of Abandonment from 2011. Her writing and filmography focuses on the conditions of otherwise in late liberalism. She is a founding member of the Caribbean Film Collective. Let's give a warm welcome to our speakers. And I think we'll also start, because I hope most of you have caught the mini exhibition in the back. We'll start with Natasha Gunwala giving a short introduction to the exhibition, and I hope you can also catch it after the screening.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here and for taking the time to visit our one night only collectively realized display here this evening. The display is very much also a materialization of the journal issue itself, with Beth collectively rethinking many threads of conversation and examples that have been pulled together by the writers. So this idea of building and crumbling worlds is embedded in a sense, extending from exhaustion into the backspin of endurance again, and of a re-emergence of also scales of temporality that perhaps allow for an otherwise to resurface. And so we move from examples such as Dilip Gankar's readings of the riot, the collective body of the riot, as molecular event, as collective agent, the disciplined and indisciplined formations that the riot brings us to, the structures through which demands are displaced and emplaced. Then there's also Beth's gathering of materials in which she thinks of maybe an imagination, which is also this weave that she might discuss as part of today's discussions. And Landings brings together work by filmmakers Ritu Sareen and Tenzing Sonam, the artist Prabhakar Pachpute, who reveals aspects of the carbon imaginary to exceed it. And we also have images of the California gold rush as stereoscopic images that bring a sensual reading of that particular 19th century history of the mine. And we also have examples from the Caribbean Film Collective's work as well. So, yeah, thank you.
So what we're going to do is, am I okay? Nope. Am I on? Yeah, my little butt pack is on. Can you hear me, Sherry? Okay. So what we're going to do is each one of us is going to speak for about 10 minutes. And yeah, I think that's what it is, right? Okay. Yes, and thank you for coming. It's fantastic. I'm hoping that you guys interrupt. Not well. I'll get angry if you interrupt, but like push and shove and think with us tonight. So what I want to do with my 10 minutes is on the way to talking about why I came to think with many people around what I call the quasi-event, but a concept that others phrase in different ways. That is, I think, that's very sweet, a sweetest introduction, but I'm hardly the only one who's trying to think about the kind of temporality and materiality that I use the phrase quasi-event for, so I should say that first. But on the way to talking about the quasi-event, I want to start first by situating it in concepts of the event and an event, and why I think there's an absolute political, aesthetic, and affective demand on us to put aside the event, but in a very particular way, in which I mean put aside the event. And when I say the event, so the event, I don't mean, say it, the movement from 1 to 2 to 3 onward and outward, but an imaginary and an affective desire to experience, to make, to find oneself within certain kinds of decisive breaks. That is, the break between 0 and 1, which is huge and much bigger than anything between 1, 2, 3, and 5 on the way to infinity. That is, the break between non-life and life, the break between non-being and being, the break between having no one and never having had it anyone, and suddenly you have someone, you know, the one who is for you. The Big Bang, right? All of this idea and concept of the event that decisively breaks and brings into being a whole new form. Now, we often, and of course, are revolutionary imaginaries around this, right? What will decisively bring the revolution that will change, that will break history? For a very long time, the event has been thought through, for a very long time, it was thought through a debate between two people. Deleuze on the one side, at one hand, and Badiou on the other. And although I don't think we ever mention Badiou in this essay, in this issue, he really, for me, sits as the decisive other to what I'm trying to think through. So, for instance, we could all say by heart, if you know this literature, that for Deleuze, the important thing is not even the event so much, but an event, right? Just an event. What or how can something appear, right? New. How can something new be seen? What are its conditions, right? So, and we want to know that because we want to make an event happen, right? We want to overthrow Wall Street. We want to fall in love. We want to pull in a new kind of social form that we think will be more just, and decisively so. And so for, Deleuze would have been the name that we would turn to, in which Deleuze says, yes, we have to leave aside the question of essence, metaphysics of essence. We have to leave aside the question of what is, right? What is? And instead ask the question of existence, what exists and how does it exist? How does it hold on? How does it endure the conditions in which it lives? And we have to ask, Deleuze said, about the event. So instead of truth, what is true, i.e., how do we know what is and what is true? We have to say what comes into being, right? The becoming. That's what we have to, not truth, but event. The crucial, again, debates for a very long time in critical theory center on exactly this problem. So you have Badiou coming in and saying, no, I, Badiou, own the multiple, not you, Deleuze, right? And I, Badiou, right, am going to decisively define the relationship between truths and event, right? So I'm going to turn to you, Deleuze, and say, actually, there's truths. There's no truth, but they're truths. There's no event, but there are events, right? And the reason I think it's important for us to understand what's at stake in Badiou's way of talking to Deleuze, and thus Quentin Melissu's way of thinking about existence. So all our speculative realists who, it's amazing books, and it's an amazing thing, but at the core, I think, is something really quite decisive. We have to decide what we think about it. And it has to do with this. At the core of the debate between Badiou and Deleuze is a question about the partitionability of things in existence. What does that mean? Deleuze, and there's this great guy, Daniel Smith, who's a philosopher. Deleuze and Badiou both are thinking through mathematical models, right? Deleuze is thinking through an old calculus in which concepts of threshold are always on the table. Right? So thresholds, becomings, blurrings, leakings, and etc. What Badiou says he's doing, and it's really important, is he's getting rid of anything that leaks. Using, and again, I'm not going to go into set theory. We don't have time. It bore the shit out of you. But it's important because set theory depends on being able to provide definite, distinguishable objects that you can put a bracket around. There's no leakage. That's the whole issue here. That you start with axioms and you get discrete objects. That's how you can say there are truths. Now, with his set theory, it goes on. It's transfinite. It goes on and on. But there are truths because there are things that can be made partitionable, known, held. Right? And then for Badiou, you go from there and you say, well, there are truths because there are things that do exist and can become objects. Right? But there are only, we can't know what it is because it's transfinite, it goes on and on. That has to do with set theory. But there are things, they're not, and so there can't be an event because everything's already existing in truth. So how do you break truths that are just onward and outward and on and on? What you have to do for Badiou is you create, through truth procedures, events. And here I just, and so you say, in this very partitionable world, right, in which there are objects that are discrete and knowable and real, an event will happen in which it seems a space of partition folds back on itself. And he gives a great example of May 68. Right? So May 68, on the one hand, were a bunch of facts, things happened, right? A lot of things happened. Or the Wall Street movement, right? Things happened, a bunch of things happened. But Occupy Wall Street and May 68 fold those things into a whole that comes to have a name. Occupy Wall Street, May 68. Right? And by folding back in this reflex way, we create events. That sounds great, right? Yay, we love that. The trouble is that Badiou is very clear that these events aren't real in the sense of simply holdable onto because they dissipate very quickly. So how do you keep them in place? How do you say something happened when things continue to happen? And here's Badiou's answer: militant fidelity. Right? So he says there are 4 ways you can prove truth: in love, in politics, in art, and politics, art, love, who's the other one? Science, math, right? All can prove, forget about that one. Right? So May 68, it happened. Well, how do you keep it happening? Badiou says through militant fidelity. I hold and will not give up the assertion that May 68 happened. Right? Well, that's cool with Occupy Wall Street. I don't give up the affective belief or assertion that Occupy Wall Street happened. No matter that it fell apart, I say it still happened. And I say it militantly. Right? Again, sounds great. We all like that. Up against the wall, motherfucker. Let's just insist that our events happen. Even as we say, of course, it's ongoing and transparent, but we insist it happen. That sounds great until, say, you get to love. And we see something else that might appear. I insist that I had the event of love. Right? And I'm militant about it. What does that turn into? Stalking, rape, right? Then you take this militant fidelity, like I refuse, right? And you turn it back to these other politics. And you start thinking, oh, wait a minute. Right? What do these other politics come to look like? Okay. So on the one hand, what are we really pledging allegiance to when we pledge allegiance to a certain kind of event theory? And I think we have to be really careful about this. We pledge allegiance to the question of becoming and leakage and thresholds. What does that commit us to? We pledge allegiance to this idea of set objects that we hold in place by a kind of stubborn refusal. In the background of this is what this is how I was thinking. And in the background of this, I say, well, what if we started somewhere else? What if we just said, to hell with the event? This is coming out of a very particular kind of politics, a very particular kind of notion of affect and attachment. And what if we started somewhere else? What if we started with distracted attention, tsunamis of thresholds, exhausted materials, right? All those things that set theory in which it's decisive tries to push out of the picture, right? To hell with thresholds, to hell with even quasi-events is wrong for me because it still says there's an event, right? What about something that's just kind of leaky? There'd be the weak way of approaching this quasi-event, leaking event, threshold event. Like, what was that? What was that? Right, this flighty thing. And the weak way would be, how do we make quasi-events become decisive? How do we accumulate all the quasi-events, make them cohere, make them differ, so that something can happen? For instance, my colleagues in Australia, my very close friends, who live in these worlds, which I've, in the article we talked about, live in these worlds of leakage, of what was that? Like, just below the threshold, right? Low intensity. Well, the weak way of using this concept of quasi-event or low threshold, low frequency, is to say, okay, if we want something to happen in these areas of poverty and impoverishment, then what we got to do is take all those quasi-events, make them into event, and pow, make them out. Well, that's actually just a weak argument, and all you're doing is saying, I believe in the event. I totally believe in the event. I'm just trying to get an event out of here. So the strong argument, and the question that I have no answer for yet, but I think is what I believe should be on the table. The strong argument is something like, is it in the nature of materiality, is the nature of, I should say, the nature of materiality best approached via this notion of partitionability and rupture? Is that the best way we should approach it? Or is nature or materiality or affect something that is fundamentally not partitionable, that can't be ruptured, that leaks? Do we say of these places that we'll hear about more that, what just happened? Wait, how did we get here? Where's this? Were you paying attention? did I just love you? Right? How do we not say how to make those spaces into our revolutionary politics, but rather have those spaces turn and tell us something about how politics and love and aesthetics and maybe science and math should be today?
I don't know much about love, but I will talk about politics. I wrote this essay I'm glad I was able to write it because Beth twisted my arms to get this paper out on riots. I mean, she's been twisting my arms for a long time. The point I want to talk about people who are sort of outside history to some extent. I mean, that is a little too aggressive a statement because the question is who makes history, who is in history, all arises. But I'm talking about those people whose actions, whose politics, whose way of life, and whose mode of being in the world never really adds up to an event. What do I mean by that? I want to sort of, want to work on the ground level, and I want you to think about, as they are unfolding today, two sets of riots. I mean, in fact, there are not just two sets of riots. There are all kinds of riots going on. But the ones that took place in Ferguson in United States and the one that is unfolding now in Hong Kong. I mean, you have to think about how they are represented, one, but I don't really want to talk about so-called politics of representation and signification, but rather be naive and say there are two ways people are talking about and thinking about. And you'll see there's a preoccupation which haunts political theory in generally, that is the preoccupation with order. And the way one talks about Hong Kong, even though it's a protest, it's a demand for so-called democracy, but there's a constant emphasis about how the young students, so agreeable, so charming, so well-behaved, are always cleaning up the trash they leave behind. That is basically, even though their actions or their protest may be seen as disorderly from some molar point of view, in a molecular level, they're seen as very orderly. And in a way, the uptake is they get pulled into the idea that protest can be orderly. And in future, at some point, if in fact democracy movement succeeds in Hong Kong and further sometime maybe in China, and it probably will happen, this moment will be recaptured as an eventful one, as having a recognizable sort of a skin, so to speak, that it becomes an event. It will be reconstructed. All events or quasi-events are sort of, really events are reconstructed and rewritten in history, and that will be seen. Whereas Ferguson will, sort of disappear in that mass of episodes and eruptions which are called riots. You'll never see the word riot, although the Chinese Communist Party and the powers that be are trying to suggest it is some kind of a riotous behavior. That is not the way the world is actually viewing it or the uptake is. Whereas Ferguson, right from the beginning, people say, what do these people want? Obviously, they have no end that is delineable, no clear political project, whereas you look at Hong Kong and you immediately say what they want is democracy, however amorphous the idea of democracy may be. So in a way, you see, although within Marxism, the so-called working class, the proletariat was a revolutionary vanguard agency, within the late liberalism or liberalism in general, the middle class is the kind of a revolutionary agent, or at least the one who seeks for different kinds of emancipation. And that's what the young students of Hong Kong are named as. They are agents, whereas in Ferguson, they are what Lauren Berlant and Beth talk about as precariats, and they have no agency because they have no end, they have no goal, they are not even recognizable, because they are not even seen as either individual or collective, they are not nameable, right? So this unnameability of the so-called people outside of history or people who engage in periodic riots are objects of my interest and theorizing to some extent. Now why? You just have to simply take the amount of things, amount of sort of eruptions and riots that are taking place in the world, including in mainland China, something like 150,000 so-called mass people's incident take place. Whereas in India, it is a daily affair, literally. I mean, you know, every time I go to Mumbai, you know, by the time I get out of the airport to get to my place, I will see at least one demonstration if it is the daytime. So as a result, many of the flights arriving in Mumbai are at midnight, so we don't see riots. You know, but otherwise, we always see some eruption, right? In India, in the Indian subcontinent, riot has become a kind of a fine art. They are there all the time. But this is not only in India, but it's almost all the global south, whether it is in Nigeria, whether it is in Brazil, they are happening. But when they take place as the agency of the middle class, it gets attention, gets political theorizing, whereas if it happens from the so-called subaltern class, or that even word subaltern is no longer applicable because subaltern has a palpable characteristic. Far more they are seen as lumpen proletariat and they are excluded. Now the question is why even the academics, intellectual, even some of us here cannot sympathize with them is because this phenomena is considered having no redeemable social value. Because they have no end, they have clear plan. They don't have any redeemable social value, they don't have end because in many ways our conception of temporality is so different for their conception of temporality. If upper middle class or even middle class Americans are constantly running short of liquidity is because about 60% of the income or even more of that goes into healthcare, if you have children, saving college fund and paying mortgage, right? There's very little left over. Whereas as a result, what the point I'm trying to make is not complaining about my existence, but rather what I'm trying to point out about how deeply invested we are in future and our conception of temporality. Whereas the people in Ferguson have a completely different temporality. The question people say, why do we come night after night to protest and demonstrate? Because it is more fun to be demonstrating rather than stay home and in the next morning you don't even have to go to work because you don't have a job. There's a limit to which people can even protest and demonstrate because they have a job, there are various ways in which their energy gets depleted. That's what, in fact, Communist Party of China is hoping, keeping quiet and let the students burn their energy out. Maybe they will succeed. But in the case of Ferguson and all, you can never really burn your energy because there's endless supply of energy because that energy cannot be directed at other so-called bourgeois productive ends. Or they would aspire to do that, but they don't have opportunity. So as a result, all over the world, this vast number of people are erupting into this kind of a riotous behavior with a very different kind of a temporality. And the point basically is, but they are not being impractical because every time you riot, you get something. It's not like you get what would be considered from our point of view a long-term advantage. That's why I want to sort of end because I don't want to speak much too long because we are supposed to give have 10 minutes. I was sort of told, in fact, when I proposed the idea that I wanted to write about this essay but ended up writing something else, I said to Beth, I want to write about what you call onion riots in India. I mean, you probably haven't heard there's such a thing as onion riots. The question you really have to ask why there are periodic onion riots in a country like India and then probably in places like Nigeria and things like that. When the price of onion goes up, you know, it severely affects the life of people who live under $1 or $2 a day, right? So as a result, for instance, one constantly you'll think about in India there would be mango riots because if you ask any Indian, what are you so most proud of all the vegetables and fruits and all, they say mango. And any time I told them Mexican mangoes are just as good as Indian mangoes, they say no, that's not possible. But there is never a documented event of mango riots in India. You see, the riots, food riots, bread riots were common in Europe in the 17th and 18th century when the bread prices would go up, so-called 4-pound loaf of bread in France before the revolution. But today, that kind of riot happens. But that is not the only kind of riot happens. But I wanted to talk about onion riots. Onion is where you can see the index of temporality of the poor people. They're constantly watching the price of basic staples as they're going up and down. And people can say, if you're ever into a modern finance, you'll say, why don't you sort of buy up while the price is low? In anticipation, because they don't have enough money. So as a result, they're watching. They also do practical activity. They would buy about 1 week or 2 weeks of onion supply if they see price going up, but they can't buy it for a whole year. They don't have Walmart, where you can have big peanut jar, or things like that. Sort of you can stock up for the rest of your winter or something like that. So as a result, when you begin to analyze something like Onion Riot, you begin to see how their way of life, the way of thinking about time, goals and ends change. And so long as not only the upper classes, not the powers that be, but the intellectual and the middle class and all do not get a sense of the phenomenology, the lived experience of the precariat, there's going to be this incredible gap. And in fact, the idea of mobilizing the people to speak to truth to power cannot be done by the middle class unless they have the so-called precariat or this vast majority of people behind them. So the question basically is, how do we do this? In a way, political theory, I don't think is capable of doing it in a variety of ways. Art and literature, in many ways, have been doing this. This is what you mean by the molar and molecular, or molar or event and quasi-event. Have I got the... I can now do two things at the same time, right? So that's what I'm worried. So the point about art and literature is, when you think about molar construction like French Revolution, American Revolution, the civil rights movement in America and things like that, and when you write, historically construct and everything fitting together into a set theory or into a set and recognizable object. But actually, when literature treats it, when it tells the story, including the autobiographies written by Black Panthers and so on and so forth, what you see is the narrative life where people do all kinds of things other than just fight for justice. They have to eat, they have to pay rents, they have to evade police sometimes, they fall in love and so on. Art and literature has always, even though when they want to try to sum up what the French Revolution is or civil rights movement is, they try to have this strategy of synecdoche, that they're going to tell the story through the eyes of people and minor actors and figures and so on and so forth. Even though the aspiration is for a molar interpretation, what they invariably succeed against the aspiration of the writer, against the aspiration of the director of the film and all, they end up telling molecular stories. And not only that, this shows you, for instance, why repeatedly the artists pick up again and again the objects or stories which are quite different. When you think about, for instance, the stories about the ship, there are a lot of ship films. You'll see, for instance, Mutiny on the Bounty. The story of Bounty, even Hollywood has about 5 different versions of Mutiny on the Bounty, starting from Clark Gable to Marlon Brando and goes on like this, right? And think about how many stories there are about Mayflower movies. What kind of a movie can you make about Mayflower? You can't. Those guys, Puritans, saying we're going to write a charter and then we're going to create a United States. No story to tell. The art, Mutiny on the Bounty has endless supply of information, endless subtext, right? And you will see this again and again in the same way with, Renoir's Marseille, the movie. You start with the French Revolution, Bastille and things like that, then the stories of all different little stories. This is why art and literature is always been ahead in the account of the molecular world. And political theory, sociological theory, they were already preoccupied with the molar structures. And this is where you see what happens when there are people like Badiou. I will end up with the example of Badiou. Since 2008, there have been riots and riots and riots, all kinds of things, not only in the global south, but also in England, France, in Italy, and in Greece, and so on and so forth. And there are 2 important figures we have already mentioned. That is, what is the title of the book? It is probably the worst book Badiou has ever written. It's called Rebirth of History. This is literally directed at, he can't look at all these riots and not say, this is a rebirth of history. And then Fukuyama has published a couple of essays in, of course, in Wall Street Journal, and which says, in fact, all these 2008 post-riots confirm the history has ended, right? It is because this is the emergence of middle class demanding deeper and wider democracy. So they constantly are talking about history, either end of history, which is also an event, or rebirth of history, which is also an event, right? Look at the preoccupation, and you see, you can't imagine two theorists or two political sides as divergent as Fukuyama and Baidu, but that's what they do. But there is, in between, there's an endless fabric of life which unfolds in a very alluring way, and that's what I think, and there is the emergence, endurance, suffering, all of that there. But I also want to make one point, only one, that the idea that somehow this will end up with a kind of a change of order, that's not necessarily the case, because in Bangkok there was a red shirt riot, went on for 55 days, nothing happened to economy. In India, the Marxists or so-called Maoists occupy about one tenth or so of the land, and that doesn't affect Indian economy. So one should not think about riots as bringing about radical transformation before we think about what it means. Thank you.
So to continue from there on, Julieta and I are now going to be in conversation for about 20 minutes. And what we'd like to do is evoke three kinds of figures as negative responses to the idea of the quasi-event. And those three figures are the earthquake, the virus, and energy. And so to start with the earthquake.
I think yeah, you should be able to. Oops, I'm on.
So this in the background now is Zalzala Jazira, earthquake island, or Zalzala Ko, which is earthquake mountain, which appeared off the coast of Balochistan in 2013 as the result of an earthquake measuring 7.7 on the Richter scale. So just a few hundred miles from the epicenter of this earthquake came up this mud volcano island as a sort of radical emergence. In the form of events then, what it was a sedimentary event which brought together sort of psychosocial and geological temporality into an entwinement, but also into a form of contagion. Contagion that radically changed even the capacity of the water surrounding this island. So what you have on this island are these volcanoes and vapors. So one is not sure whether it is solid, liquid, or gas. It's continually changing. And that condition was also something that Julieta and I were very, very interested in and kept coming up with different examples that have these enfoldments of the earthquake island resurfacing at points of geopolitical disruption as well as of seismic shift. And so in this case, this particular island is located in the territories where drone operations from the US are very close by, where the water boundaries between India and Pakistan are still being contested. And so it still becomes a form of land that does not allow for a nationalist history. It will delete itself, it will submerge before a completion of belonging in the national sense is even able to happen.
I mean, like something, when Natasha was telling me this story, can you hear me? Yes? No? No? Yes? Yes? Okay. When Natasha was telling me this story, something, when Natasha was telling me this story, what happened is that something came back to me, which is a subject that has been part of my work for a long time, or part of my desire to work, actually, which is, I'm going to talk a little bit about rehearsal right now, because this is the rehearsal of what Natasha was telling us. And this is something that happened in 1831, off the coast of Sicily, there was this emergence as well. This volcanic island, all of a sudden in August 1831, came up. And it became quite important immediately because this is a time when boats were having traffic routes with, trading routes with Africa. So this land emergence that came up in international waters was contested immediately by England, France, Sicily, which was not Italy then, and Spain. And each territory gave it a different name. So for Sicily it was Ferdinandea, for England it was the Graham Islands, for France it was the Julia Island, and so on. And they were all very gung-ho in trying to get this territory, and they sent geologists and artists to make this beautiful, if you go back one image, to make these beautiful depictions, because of course there were no cameras, and they lined all these boats, and they were about to go to war. And they were about to effectively start the First World War, and it was like this fantastic dress rehearsal for it. And suddenly, as fast as it came up, this island disappeared in December 1831. And it was quite interesting because it set the stage for a certain kind of political event which happened 30 years later. It was sort of like, okay, next century we'll do it again, this time with feeling, right? And the thing, I mean, what's kind of interesting is that to this day, there is such a thing as the Knights of Jerusalem, which are these Sicilian knights that are sort of at this point dedicated to the preservation of Ferdinandea. And they are all these men who are kind of wealthy and have inherited this position from God knows what, from the Crusades. And they are all lawyers and doctors and so on, but they are also divers. And their main thing in life is to go down to put on this plague in the bottom of this volcano, which then the equivalent group of people in England go and smash and replace by a plaque that says, and this is the Graham Island, which proudly belongs to the British Crown. And I mean, it's quite fascinating. That's the stage where this happens. And I mean, that's just like thinking in terms of rehearsal and this kind of emergence and what kind of politics did that set the stage for. And then we jump a little bit to something that I call negative emergence, which is yet another island. This one in the South Pacific. I mean, it's not an island, it's an archipelago. And this is a place called Kiribati, or actually Kiribati, if I shall pronounce it correctly, which is this group of 33 islands that's straddled, at the end of the map, the one thing that falls off the fucking map. If you look at the map, you will never see it. You may see a little thing with the name of the place. In any case, this group of islands holds the distinction of being the very first place that is going to go under. And amongst other things, they were used, because they are in the absolute end of the universe, they were used as testing ground for atomic bombs, which are these beautiful images that you can see now. And the other thing that happened in terms of war, which I like this place very much because it also has something to do with world conflicts. What happened is, the best thing that happened there is, well, not best, is that Japan and the US had a battle, which was a disaster because, of course, these territories in the doldrums, and they could not calculate the tides, and they tried to do this fantastic invasion with tanks and planes, and everybody drowned, and everybody died, and everybody had, whomever was alive had to go home, and they just left everything there at the end of this thing. So what you have is, if you go there, as I did, what you find is this incredibly strange landscape that's peppered with tanks and sunken boats and so on. As a prelude to Pearl Harbor, basically. And what then you realize is like that this is at the end of history, because there is like an entire culture that lives there, that is about, that in this land that is about to stop being land, that have an absolute indifference to this event that marked the entire 20th century, that makes me refer to artwork as what's post-war and pre-war and so on. Like, these are people that have to live with these fossils of a history that does not touch them. And that's the, I mean, like, I found that quite interesting, because that's like the notion of, like, if we're going to belonging, then there is a moment where history belongs to you, or you belong to history. And you belong to land, and you don't belong to land. And what they were trying to do, like, in this sense of belonging, was, as Kiribati has like 10 years left, or something along those lines, they are looking for a new home, of course. But the interesting thing is that they are trying to be taken over as a culture, as something that does not get assimilated but belongs. They belong to themselves. They belong. There is a notion there that is quite essential. That is not. We will not become Australians. They will not let us. But even if they did, we will not become Australians. We are what we are. We belong. So that was the.
And to then extend this idea of belonging to Earth and Earth history, we go to this example of a work by the Autolit group, which is called Medium Earth, and which has had an additional segment called Who Does the Earth Think It Is, which is now on display at the House of World Cultures. And in this two-part work, what the Autolit group is surveying is the seismic sensitivity of California, the seismic subconscious of California, as you wish, through the figures of the fault line, the desert, and the earthquake sensitive. And so what you have here then are certain kind of collisions of belief at the level of bodily consciousness. So the bodily consciousness of the desert meeting with the bodily consciousness of the sensitive, whose entire morphology is then conditioned as a map, in which, say, the pain in the head is perhaps one particular region of the world, whereas the limbs are Brazil. And each time, aches and pains are identified as seismic ruptures in a particular region of the world. And there's a small but convinced community that has been sending these predictions to the US Geological Survey field office. And it is in this combination of these predictions as bodily prognosis together with the actual skimming of the surface of the desert sands and the fault lines very microscopically, that brings together the work of the Autolit group. But what it does in terms of having us talk about these negative emergences is that the formation of the event then is something that is imminent to the extent that that suffering becomes something shared between the earth body and the human body. And so even when we talk about an end time in terms of the Anthropocene as an end time in a certain sense, here there's a fracture even within that fabric, because the earthquake sensitive does not necessarily allow for this condition to enable itself, especially through a human narrative. And the earthquake sensitives also interestingly form an alliance with animals who also predict earthquakes. So the movement of ants, of slugs, of earthworms, of whales that beach themselves. And we'll come to these sort of animal figures later as again, devices that scatter the assuredness of human prediction. So, yeah.
And then, well, in a strangely optimistic note, if we are thinking about these predictions of disaster and so on, I want to also, something I've been thinking about is a lot the idea of rewilding and repopulating. and what does that mean, and how it's always being put forth in a sense of hope, and in a sense of hope that's very, very much, first of all, mammal, yeah? And we are thinking land, and we are thinking things that look like us, and we are thinking of ecosystems like you know, we have reintroduced the wolves to California, and look at the beautiful things these wolves have done, and there are rivers again, and so on, right? And Bambi, like, look over there, there's Bambi. But in reality, I mean, like, of course, there are like a ton of species disappearing all the time, but there is also a very ruthless rewilding taking place, which has nothing to do with hope. It has to do with life at its most, at the threshold of itself, right? And something that is like a quite interesting figure there is the jellyfish. These are Nomura jellyfishes, which tend to clog the pipes of nuclear plants in Japan, and of like any kind of, like they're like this completely unstoppable things that even if you kill them, they keep clogging the pipes, because you can kill them, but you cannot vaporize them. So their biomass exists and is there, and it takes all this space, and it's clearly life, yeah? It's clearly there. It's like the same, it's this, it reminds me of this as well, this, this thing that made the news recently, which was, and I'm sorry if this is all like fun facts, sorry about that. This was a virus that was found when the permafrost melted in Siberia, and had spent 30,000 years in ice, basically a fossil. And what was quite interesting for me is when they discovered that the thing was still infectious. And there is something about having been at the threshold of life and coming back and then becoming alive again and rewilding and repopulating in terms that are not agreeable to me, but have to be agreeable to me in the sense of me being alive and caring for life despite myself somehow. So that was the thought here. I mean, like and I don't know, I mean, like something thinking in terms of human, the human condition, and what's a successful virus and what a successful parasite, and the successful parasite, of course, is the one that does not kill its host. And like, how is it possible to actually not kill the host, right? That's, I'll just walk you through a couple of entertaining images of other beautiful things. These are tardigrades, which are the most enduring organisms that exist, that actually have the distinction of having been to space and come back, and can also become fossils themselves, because if they lose, they dehydrate and can spend eternities in suspended animation until they run into water again. And they are beautiful.
So also this question then of what it means for death to occur in life. That was something that really brought us to this question of the virus, and of course Beth's ongoing circles around life and non-life, and how to discuss that. So these sorts of viruses that Julieta mentioned, and rewilding, the techniques of rewilding through the understanding the phenomenon of the virus, also then brings us to the condition of the image as, say, an image that allows for allows for an unleashing of life in a kind of, in the terms of a circuit. Because this, for example, is the Bradshaw cave paintings, or the Gwion cave paintings in the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, which Vivian and I have also written about in the essay. And it was also the subject of a show called The Allegory of the Cave Painting by Mihni American. And these caves are very special because while the paintings themselves are said to originate in the Pleistocene era, the fact is that it is impossible to date them today because they refuse the carbon paradigm again. So what happens is that they do not allow for history to enter their skin, literally, because they have cyanobacteria and black fungi that have become enmeshed into the image and are regenerating the image as living pigments. So the fact that there's a vividness in these images is also then not simply the impression of an image, but a remaking of an image, not a projection, but an eating. And so it also sort of brought, it sort of also defeats the entire narrative of Plato and the cave allegory, in a sense, which we found we were very excited about. So, yeah.
And this brings us to the idea of energy. And here I introduce my negative hero, which is, I don't know if any of you are into comics, but this is Galactus, who is a Marvel negative hero, not a bad guy, but a negative hero, which is sort of like the closest that any kind of like pop culture to me has come to the idea of the demiurge. Is like this demigod that is completely indifferent to human life. However, he's perpetually hungry, and what he eats is planets. So he is, and he eats the elemental life of a planet. And he spends a lot of time looking for planets throughout all solar systems. And I find this character, besides that I find his hat quite amusing, I think that it's a quite good representation of what extraction industry is, which is something that has to do with this consumption of energy and an indifference to life. And of course, thinking about that's his ambassador, who is the Silver Surfer, that may be a little bit more well known. That it's something. I mean, like, and of course, when I was going through the images of well, this character that I had not revisited since childhood, more or less, it made me think a lot about the notion of energy and what happens with it, and what happens when we are exhausting all our fuel, and when we are like perforating the planet to such an extent that is this kind of life, not just as bio life, but also as energy, and becomes exhausted. What happens with it, and where does it go? How does it move? How does it circulate? Where does it end? Does it go to a place that is beyond materiality, but it remains there? That's I mean, like, these are questions that this kind of imagery has brought forth. Here is, how do I play this? Okay. This is what happens. Oh, we can put the sound there. I mean, I also very much appreciate, like, I mean, I'm quite enthralled by this idea of the heroics of saving, like, giving ourselves this impossible task of saving the earth, which is quite fine. What is in danger is not the earth particularly. It has a sad end.
So on the note of losing and who loses, I'd like to go back to this artist Prabhakar Pachpute, whose work is actually inside on display. and who has been working on the condition of coal, the substance of coal, and comes from a family of coal miners, and also a region in India where there has been farmer suicides for many years now. And he made this particular work called Land Escape, in which after efforts in his work to understand the psychological and the geological impact of the mine in his region, he finally decided that he would set the element, the fossil element, free in a sense. He would allow it to run away from the land that it was found in the sense that what he did was he made the coal anthropomorphic. He gave it hands and legs. And to some extent, this kind of radical imagination, this kind of complicity with the fuel itself, giving life to the fuel itself, is something that we together also felt is a useful move, is a move that we subscribe to, and that move can happen through Galactus, it can happen through this artist's incision of giving the fuel its resource, in a sense, its resource to escape, to flee. And where then the frontier, this frontier of the mine, which is in a sense a vertical frontier, is contested by the fossil, not as death but as life.
I mean, if one thinks about like this notion of energy, there is this quite interesting theory of mitochondria, which are the parts of a cell that store energy, actually having begun their existence as parasites and becoming actual successful parasites that then enter this like symbiotic relationship with the human body and became the storers of energy and fuel and so on. And thinking about that, and this kind of like what happens with the fossil and what happens with the living fossil, and do we become like what kind of like hosts as a system are we, and in which system are we hosts? And it becomes, of course, it's like a matryoshka, it's this Russian doll that you can just keep opening. And, I mean, like we went quite fast to this to whale falls, which are these. If you're not familiar, whale falls are these. Is what happens when a whale dies at sea. Of course, the bones sink, the carcass sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and it becomes a feeding ground and a thriving ground for a full-on ecosystem, and they're quite important in the generation of ocean floor life. And it's like something about like the fossil like belonging and having a kind of responsibility in death and entering and basically like refusing death in a sense that's quite particular, that sort of like brings that resolves the question for me, at least in a way that's very elegant in terms of what happens to the energy and where does it go. And so these are some images of several whale falls as they have been recorded. And the last images are not so nice, because this is what happens to a whale fall when the whale has nothing to fall to. And there is no ecosystem.
I know. I think it's.
We should.
Yeah, we should.
Straight to the bar, straight to film. So we're going to screen we're going to go straight to the film. Which is, it was conceived and performed by the Crumbling Film Collective. It was conceived and performed by the Crumbling Film Collective, and it's 34 minutes, just so you know how long it is, 34 minutes, and then we'll have a chat afterwards with the director, and David Barker, who's also edited the film. Thank you.
You know, an opportunity to talk about things in more than one discursive register, sort of around a similar topic. So I sort of wish that the Crumbling were here, because I think they would be very excited about your emergent islands. And I guess one thing that occurred to me as I heard you guys talking and I read your articles in the journal was when I first went with Beth to kind of do a workshop with the Crumbling mob, one of the first ideas that came up was actually to thematize the project around a riot that happened in the sort of Belloun place where Beth has lived, and which had radically changed the formations of their social life before and after that event. And it was something that we thought turned out to be, like, it was kind of in a way the most exciting idea, but it was also kind of socially really impractical to sort of bring back together people whose violent encounter had ruined their social world. Seemed very socially complicated. The physical production seemed all but impossible. And also representationally, it seemed to have a kind of dirty laundry quality that seemed dangerous. And but I thought it was, in some ways, does relate to things that Dilip raised, in the sense that I think it's also interesting here, particularly, to talk about the way that a film does itself theorize something, right? And that just as there is a kind of phenomenology of a riot, there is a way that their project, I think, is, as you might have it, sort of on the ground in a slum, in a kind of riot-adjacent space, but not in the time of a riot. And I guess for me, it's also interesting, like I loved hearing you talk about how for you, this time of or whatever, the quasi-event emerges directly from the kind of, some kind of mathematical love child of Badiou and Deleuze. But that there's also another legacy, maybe more than one other legacy, really, that I think ends up in the piece, right? Not only from the kind of performative traditions that come from that mob and their own, like, kind of traditional history, but also in this kind of very global way. Like I was reflecting today on a long conversation that I had with Angie, who wears the red flannel shirt and always wants to go get the house back. Do you remember that character? You know, where she had written out all of the lyrics of a Miley Cyrus song and wanted to read them with me because they were very moving to her. And they actually are to me also. I'm actually very moved by the lyrics of Party in the USA and feel that I sometimes resemble that story, actually. It's actually really, you know, it's a nice story of a lost girl who leaves home and learns how to be less awkward in an urban space. Like, so I identify with it, right? But like, anyway, my point is to say that I think even in tension with this sort of traditional cultural knowledge that is part of this film, there is also a kind of globalized grammar and cinematic phenomenology that comes from everywhere, that becomes part of the knowledge of the group, including yours and mine. And in my case, it's also part of my literal disciplinary training, if I can be said to have any, right? Which is to say that thinking about a kind of narrative formation in which important events and unimportant events are treated as equal is, I think, a really important modern tradition, and certainly, you know, in a kind of post-war European tradition, something that, I don't know, seems to me relevant in this moment. Like, it maybe didn't when I was 20 or something. Maybe it was me, maybe it was the world around us, but does seem to me to be at stake, and is part of why it's interesting for Lauren, or why it's interesting for you, or for any of us to try to think about this, how to narrate or enact a quasi-event or an eventlessness or something like that. And so for what it's worth, like, I also take an interest in like a writer like Ivani Margulis, who's worked so much on this kind of cinematic realist tradition, and think that there's a space not only for Badiou and Deleuze, but for Chantal Akerman and Andy Warhol, and also Rossellini and that period, you know. Yeah, so I could go on, but maybe it's nicer if I don't, and maybe maybe David could say something, and if people were so moved, we could answer questions or whatever.
Well, I didn't know I had to give a talk, but I don't. You know, I came to this, I mean, my relationship to this film is, I came to really totally through the film world. So I was just going, you know, I work as an editor, I was going from job to job, and this was a job. And since then, I've become more involved and was just, you know, came back from working with them this summer and talking about working on something else. So what struck me, and this is actually, it's interesting because it's the first time I've seen it since I've gotten to know everyone. So it's a radically different experience in a lot of ways.
David was in, maybe I turned this off. David was in Australia just in August when we shot the next film, so yeah.
So what I remembered seeing this is what struck me first when I first got involved with the project, and that was, I think we talked about it, was a kind of generosity, really, more than anything else, in the performers. And it's a generosity which was very unusual, and which I would only see in two places. One is in early cinema, maybe in the 30s especially, and like particularly Warner Brothers movies, and maybe continuing up until like John Wayne or someone like that might be the last example of that, like someone who actually is willing to be themselves. It's just themselves. And then in this film, and then in some of, you know, like in Pedro Costa's actors that he's working with now that came out from Fontainebleau. So it's a generosity which is only present, you know, in the beginning of film and then in post-exhaustion, basically. So that's what I kind of noticed watching this.
All I would do to really close or open or drink is to iterate something I think Liza said that relates to the generosity, which is from the Crumbling theoretical point of view, what was really important is to show that it wasn't that there were long thresholds of non-eventness and that like long durée endurance getting, right, nothing happening, and then events. But rather, and I think we achieved it in the cut, I think, which was events don't do anything either, right? And so what we think of as events, they say, you know, everyone runs around, white people, seller people run around, event, it's event, it's event, and all, you know, and again, the riot was like an event, and then all these events, but for us, the event is just another way of just an ongoing kind of putting into motion something. And we try to achieve that, I think. So the putting events and non-event or quasi-events in the same plane, but also making events minor to what we would call quasi-events. And it was for the Crumbling, it's an extraordinarily brave, I think brave. I wish they were here. There will be in Sydney and no Melbourne and where? Brisbane. But extraordinarily brave to not simply tell the story that's been told, in which there are major ruptures and then there's heroic moments and then there's et cetera, but rather to try to play themselves, playing themselves. So thank you.